My name is Daniel Krupa, and for 11 years I worked abandoned mine inspections in western Pennsylvania, mostly in the hills that sit between old company towns and state game land, where the trees have had 100 years to grow over what men did under them. If you have never seen one up close, an abandoned mine does not look like much at first. Most of them aren't the kind people picture from movies. There's no big timbered entrance with carts and lanterns and dramatic black openings in the side of a mountain. Most of what I dealt with were collapsed drifts, fenced sinkholes, hidden vents, sealed portals, fractured concrete caps, runoff channels stained orange from acid drainage, and old shafts sunk straight into the earth and forgotten by everyone, except the landowners, the state, and the people who got called when something started caving in. By the time I got assigned to Shaft 13, I had already seen 3 subsidence injuries, 1 methane flare, 2 illegal entry deaths, and a church parking lot fold inward like wet cardboard, because somebody in 1908 thought 4 rotten timbers counted as permanent support. I'm telling you that because I don't want what happened out there filed under ghost story. I was not some kid daring himself into a tunnel with a flashlight and a camera. I was 38 years old, licensed, experienced, and trained to know the difference between panic, poor visibility, bad air, structural stress, and imagination. None of that helped me in Shaft 13. The first thing you need to understand is that people hear abandoned mine inspector and think the job is about tunnels. It isn't. Most days it's paperwork, land records, maps that don't agree with each other, access roads that have washed out, and trying to match modern tree lines and ridge contours to survey work drawn by dead men whose idea of precision depended on how sober they were. You spend more time in a truck than underground. You learn to keep 2 sets of boots, a pry bar, spare batteries, flagging tape, a gas detector, folded topo maps, extra radio batteries, and a full trauma kit behind the seat. Because no matter what the job starts as, it usually turns into something harder halfway through. I worked contract inspections for reclamation and hazard assessment. We'd get called when a sink opened in a field, when a retaining wall cracked, when a stream started vanishing into new ground, when somebody found an old portal behind a trailer park, or when hunters reported a warm vent in cold weather. Sometimes we were just documenting and ranking hazards for later mitigation. Sometimes we were determining whether a site needed fencing, grouting, drainage work, a bat-compatible closure, or a cap replacement. Sometimes we were there because somebody had already fallen in. The old mine districts in Pennsylvania have a way of staying present even when the mines are gone. You can drive through a quiet stretch of hardwoods and pass a row of houses built too square and too close together to be ordinary farm homes. You can find slate piles under moss, coke ovens swallowed by laurel, stone foundations where the company store used to be, culverts draining orange into streams that should have run clear. The land never really heals right. It settles. It grows over. It keeps its shape, but something underneath remains unfinished. I didn't mind the work. In some ways I liked it. There was a routine to it that made sense to me. Review the old maps. Check deed access. Call the landowner, drive out, photograph conditions, run gas readings, check water movement, probe suspected voids, compare the surface against the plans, document, flag, recommend. I liked jobs where the problem had an explanation, a cracked seam in a cap, a washout channel undercutting fill, freeze-thaw damage, vandalized fencing. Those were fixable. You made notes, you sent them up the chain. Crews came out later. Concrete got poured. Pipes got replaced. A hole that could have killed somebody got closed. What I learned after a few years was that every district had one place older inspectors talked around instead of about. Not every place, exactly. Every cluster. Every field office area. There'd be one portal nobody wanted on a late afternoon call. One capped slope that never stayed capped. One sealed drift where the motion lights on the equipment trailers would trigger after midnight when nobody was on site. Those stories float around any dangerous job. They grow because men need something to blame besides exhaustion and bad luck. I understood that. I had a healthy respect for folklore. Sometimes folklore is just practical instruction, wearing a dramatic coat. What made Shaft 13 different was how consistent everyone was. It belonged, on paper, to a defunct bituminous operation outside a near-empty patch of Cambria County that most current maps barely bothered naming. The old company had been Consolidated Allegheny Fuel, though by the time the mine quit producing, it had changed hands twice, and then effectively ceased to exist in the paperwork. The workable seams had pinched and flooded. Fires were rumored in one section. The access roads went bad. There was a cave-in that killed 6 men in 1931, another fatality in 1947, and after that, the remaining workings were gradually abandoned, scavenged, and left to water. Standard enough story for that part of the state. The site itself sat in a fold of heavily wooded land about 4 miles off a state route, accessed by a rutted haul road that crossed a narrow bridge and climbed toward an overgrown bench cut. There had once been more infrastructure there. You could still find concrete footers, twisted anchor bolts, fragments of corrugated siding, and the base of an old hoist house, if you knew what you were looking for. Shaft 13 wasn't a drift opening in the hillside. It was a vertical access shaft sunk through rock and earth to workings below, collar reinforced long ago with concrete that had cracked, spalled, and shifted over the decades. The state had capped it in the 80s, after 2 teenagers pried through the original fence, and one of them went in. The official record said he died from the fall. The unofficial story was that his body was recovered from a crosscut too far from where physics said it should have landed. I heard that story my second year, and filed it where I filed most stories. Then I met Frank Dombrowski. Frank was one of those men certain jobs produce, because the job could not survive normal people. He had shoulders like a filing cabinet, a nose broken at least once, and a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like it had been cut down from something longer and angrier. He had started in coal before moving into reclamation work after an injury. By the time I knew him, he was in his 60s and close to retirement, one of the last men in our district who could look at a hand-drawn panel map from 1919 and tell you where the surveyor had likely lied to save time. Frank trained me on some of my earliest field inspections. He believed in competence, not reassurance. If I did something right, he grunted. If I did something wrong, I heard about it once, clearly, and was expected not to repeat it. I respected him because he respected the work. Nothing frightened him visibly. Nothing impressed him either. The only time I ever saw him go quiet for too long was when Shaft 13 came up. We were in the truck on a rain day, catching up on deferred reports. The office printer had jammed twice, somebody's microwave popcorn had burned in the break room, and Frank was using a yellow marker on a mine map so old the fold lines looked ready to split. I mentioned the site because I'd seen it in the queue. Periodic fence checks, cap condition monitoring, seep evaluation. Easy work from the look of it. Frank kept the marker on the map and said, "If they assign you that one, don't go alone." I thought he meant because of terrain or vandalism. I don't usually. He looked up then. I mean, don't go with somebody green either. That got my attention. What's wrong with it? He sat back, took off his glasses, and cleaned them with the hem of his shirt. That was his version of deciding whether somebody deserved an answer. "Nothing you can write in a report," he said. "The concrete's bad. Drainage undermines on the north edge. Fence line gets cut. Air moves odd in cold weather. That's it?" He put his glasses back on. "And if you hear a cage bell, leave." I laughed a little, because I thought he was setting me up for some old miner superstition. Frank didn't laugh back. "There's no hoist," I said. "I know. There's no cage. I know that too." I remember the room sounding louder around us after that. Printer, fluorescent lights, somebody down the hall talking on speakerphone. Frank lowered his voice the way men do when they've already decided they shouldn't be saying something. "When I first started, an older inspector named Rourke took me out there. He told me there were rules. I thought he was screwing with me. Couple months later, a field tech named Preston ignored one, not because he was brave, because he was in a hurry. They found him sitting beside the truck with his hard hat off and both ears bleeding like he'd shoved nails in them. Never worked field again. I said what anyone would say. What actually happened? Frank looked back down at the map. You tell me if you ever hear the bell. That should have been the end of it. In a better version of my life, it was. It became one more strange thing an older guy said on a long afternoon. But about 9 months later, Frank retired. And a week before he did, he handed me a thin black notebook in the parking lot after shift. No label, no office stamp. Just a cheap field book with warped cardboard covers and water swelling along the edges. What's this? I asked. Take it, he said. I flipped it open. The first few pages were dates and weather notes, gas readings, fence repairs, cap measurements. Then I saw the heading written in block letters. I looked up at him. Frank was watching the road instead of me. Should have burned it, he said. Didn't feel right handing it to the office. They'd laugh until they needed it. Frank. He lit a cigarette and held it between 2 fingers without taking a drag. I'm retired in 4 days. Means I don't owe you comfort. Read it before you go out there. If you think it's old man nonsense, fine, but read it first. Who wrote this? Started with Rourke, then Mercer, then me. Add to it if you need to. He finally took a drag, exhaled, and gave me a hard look. And Daniel, he said, if you ever find a lamp burning underground, you leave it where it is. Then he got in his truck and drove out of the lot. I didn't read the notebook for another 3 weeks. That delay bothers me now because it feels like arrogance in hindsight. But the truth is, fieldwork piles up. Storm damage, washouts, complaint inspections, end-of-quarter documentation. You tell yourself you'll get to something when you have time, and then a month is gone. The notebook sat in the map pocket behind my passenger seat until an early November call sent me to the site, after a deer hunter reported fence damage and fresh footprints near the old access road. I remembered the notebook halfway there. The morning was cold enough that the ditches still held a skin of ice in shadow. The sky had that flat white look western Pennsylvania gets late in the year, when the clouds sit low and the ridges seem cut off at the top. I parked at the bridge, took the notebook out, and read it before I drove the rest of the way in. The first half was what I expected. Practical notes disguised as lore. Watch for undercutting along the northeast margin. Don't trust old timbers exposed after heavy rain. In winter, frost can hide fractures in the cap. If animal bones are present near the fence break, check for illegal dumping downslope. Useful things. Then, on a page dated 13 years earlier in Frank's handwriting, the tone changed. Rules are not for every visit. Most days nothing happens. That is the mistake. Men start thinking the place is normal because it is quiet more often than not. Do not wait for confirmation. If one of these starts, leave. If leaving means failing the inspection, fail it. Below that were 6 numbered rules. 1. If you hear a bell from below, do not approach the caller to listen. Mark the time and walk back to the truck without answering it in any way. 2. If your radio repeats your own transmission in a voice that is not yours, do not transmit again. 3. If you find new boot prints that begin where you can see all directions for 50 yards, do not follow them toward the shaft. 4. If water is moving inward against grade, do not stay long enough to photograph it. 5. If anyone below asks for a count, do not give numbers out loud. 6. Never enter shaft 13 after noon, and never enter it at all if you smell lamp oil where there should be none. At the bottom, Frank had added a line later in darker ink. 7. If you must go below, leave one light on the surface, facing away from the shaft. If the beam turns toward the collar by itself, do not come back up that way. I sat in the truck with the notebook open in my lap and felt embarrassed for taking it seriously. Then, I felt embarrassed for not taking it seriously. That's the way fear usually starts in grown men. Not with panic, with annoyance, with your brain trying to push a thing back into a category it understands. I set the notebook on the seat, drove up the last stretch of road, and started what should have been a routine fence and cap inspection. The site opened from the trees all at once. The old bench cut had grown in with brush and saplings, but the cleared footprint around the shaft was still visible as a bald, uneven circle of yellow grass, stone fill, and busted concrete. The cap installed in the 80s sat over the collar like a broad gray plug, reinforced with steel grid and vent piping. The chain-link perimeter fence leaned in 2 places and had been cut clean through along the west side. Somebody had peeled it back and wired it open. That part didn't surprise me. Every remote hazard site attracts trespassers eventually. People cut fences for scrap, for hunting access, for dares, for drinking, for no reason at all. I photographed the damage, logged the time, checked the posts, and walked the perimeter. The ground was damp from rain 2 nights earlier. I found boot prints near the fence opening, almost immediately. Work boots, maybe men's size 10 or 11, decent tread, fresh within a day. There should have been a straightforward path in and out from where they crossed the grass. Instead, the prints started 12 feet inside the fence line. I stopped and looked behind me. Open ground in every direction, exactly the way the notebook described. Low brush at the margins. Nothing tall enough in the immediate clearing to conceal a person's approach. The prints had not come across the grass from the fence opening, and they had not come from the old road behind me. They simply began near the cap, as if the man wearing them had stepped down from empty air and then walked toward the shaft. I crouched and studied them, because that was the rational thing to do. Maybe I'd missed earlier impressions in stonier ground. Maybe the angle was wrong. Maybe runoff had erased part of the trackway. I spent a full minute proving none of that to myself. The boot prints led directly to the cap, stopped at the vent pipe, turned once in a half circle, and ended. No return track, no second set, just a beginning and an ending. I stood up slower than I needed to, and looked around the clearing again. The wind had dropped. Even the brush at the tree line looked still. I could hear water somewhere downhill, and the faint metallic tick from one loose section of chain link moving against a post. I thought of Rule 3. What I did next is important, because it's the last normal choice I remember making out there for a while. I did not go to the cap. I took 2 photos from where I stood, marked the fence breach for urgent repair, and started back toward the truck, intending to call the office and tell them the site needed a second visit with another inspector, due to suspicious activity. That was when I heard the bell. Not loud, not dramatic. 3 clean metallic strikes from below the earth, spaced evenly apart. It sounded exactly like what it was not supposed to sound like. A cage bell from an old shaft hoist, the kind used to signal between levels and the surface. I had heard recordings before in training material and local history archives. There is a sharpness to that metal note, a little hollow ring after each strike, as if the air itself remembers the cage moving. I stopped walking because every muscle in my back locked before my thoughts did. 3 more strikes came up through the vent pipe. I did not turn around at first. Some part of me refused to give the sound the dignity of acknowledgement. I remembered the rule almost word for word. Do not approach the collar to listen. So I marked the time, exactly as written, 10:14 a.m., on my field pad with a hand that had gone stiff, and I walked back to the truck. It felt ridiculous. It also felt like the only intelligent thing I had ever done. I got in, shut the door, and sat there with my gloves on the steering wheel, waiting for the normal world to rush back in. It didn't. My pulse was hammering up in my throat. The clearing outside the windshield looked no different than before. Gray sky, damaged fence, pale grass, dark tree line. But it had changed category. It was no longer a work site. It was a place where something impossible had just been polite enough to announce itself. I picked up the radio mic. Unit 4 to District. Field check at Cambria Site 13. Do you copy? Static. Then, a second later, my own transmission came back through the speaker, in a voice that was nearly mine, and wrong, in a way I can still hear when I wake up some nights. Unit 4 to District, it said, flatter than my tone, with a wet scrape under the words like air moving through a damaged throat. Field check at Cambria Site 13. Do you copy? I set the mic down so fast it cracked against the dash. The return transmission ended in a little click, and then a breath. A human breath, close to the speaker. Rule 2 said, do not transmit again. I put the truck in gear and drove out with the radio hissing beside me, all the way back to the paved route. That should have been enough. It would have been enough for most people. Write up the damaged fence, note interference, request assistance, move on. But no dangerous place stays alone for long once it knows your name. That afternoon, I opened Frank's notebook again in the office and read the rest of it. The entries weren't regular. Sometimes months or years separated them. Some pages were just weather dates and cap conditions. Some were practical notes on prior subsidence. But whenever one of the rules had been triggered, the handwriting changed, tighter, faster. Every man who wrote in that notebook seemed to believe he was documenting a pattern he hoped somebody else would not have to use. Rourke's entries were the oldest. He mentioned the bell first, then voices requesting account from below, then warm air in snow conditions, and new footprints with no approach. Mercer, who took over after Rourke, described hearing tools move under the cap when no access existed. Frank wrote about a site visit where runoff water climbed toward the shaft instead of away after rain. Another inspector, name not given, had supposedly entered below before the closure work in the late 70s and returned missing 4 hours of time and the skin from 2 fingers on his left hand, as if he had torn them away trying to pull free of something. Most of that I could have dismissed as accumulated field mythology, if not for the consistency of the details. Men embellish stories, but they don't usually preserve the same narrow absurdity across decades. The bell, the count, the boot prints, the lamp oil, the insistence on not giving numbers. At the back of the notebook, there was one loose page, folded twice, and tucked into the cover. It wasn't a field note. It was a photocopy of a handwritten incident summary from 1947, likely taken from company records before they vanished into some archive or basement. The header read, much of it was hard to make out, but one line stood clear, because Frank had highlighted it years earlier. Foreman reports cage signal received from below after all surviving men had already been accounted for at surface. And farther down, volunteer descent ceased when unknown party below requested count of men remaining on surface. There was no conclusion to that sentence. The copy cut off, or the original had been damaged. I sat there after everyone left, reading those words until the office cleaning crew came through and asked if I was locking up. The next week the site got escalated, not because of me, because a local landowner called in a complaint that kids had been seen driving up the access road after dark. The county wanted the fence repaired quickly, and because I had the freshest documentation, the revisit fell to me. I requested a second inspector. Our district was short-handed after a storm response. I got paired with Kyle Burns, 24 years old, smart enough, decent in the field, but new. Too new. I almost refused the assignment. The part of me that still wanted to think well of myself said I should have. The part that signed my paycheck knew how hard it was to justify the site gives me a bad feeling in a public safety job, so I compromised in the stupid way adults do. I told myself I would keep the visit short, stay entirely on the surface, complete the documentation, and get out. I did not tell Kyle about the notebook on the drive-in. I told myself I didn't want to prime him with ghost stories. The truth is, I didn't want to hear it out loud. He was talking most of the ride anyway, about hunting season, and a truck repair estimate, and whether I thought he should apply for a longer-term state slot if one opened. He had the loose confidence of somebody who still believed danger, when it came, would be obvious. When we reached the clearing, the first thing I noticed was the fence. It had been repaired, not by our office, not by county maintenance, by somebody else, carefully and correctly enough to look almost official from a distance. The cut section had been retied with fresh wire. Bent posts were straightened. Even a loose top rail had been seated back into its coupling. Kyle said, "Well, that saves us a call." I got out slowly. "Stay by the truck a minute." He frowned. "What's up?" "I want to look first." I walked the perimeter alone. The fresh wire was bright against the old rusted links. The repairs were real, no question. But whoever had done them hadn't come through the access road mud. There were no tire tracks new enough, no equipment marks, no discarded ties, no footprints except ours. I felt that same angry embarrassment rise in me, the one that comes right before fear, like the world is mocking your need for cause and effect. "Kyle," I called, "come here, but don't go inside the fence." He joined me, hands in his jacket pockets against the cold. "Who fixed it?" "No idea. Could have been the landowner. Could have, but I didn't believe it." We took photos from outside the fence. I checked the cap visually. Kyle wrote measurements. The air had that iron and whetstone smell old mine sites get, with a little decaying leaf mold under it. Then another smell slipped through so faintly I almost thought I imagined it. Oil, not gasoline, not diesel. Lamp oil, thin and slightly sweet. I turned my head toward the vent pipe and the smell vanished. "Rule 6, I said. "We're done." Kyle looked down at his pad. "We haven't checked the north edge drainage. We'll note it for follow-up." He gave me a look, like he was deciding whether this was a test. "Frank says you always finish the walk." Frank's retired. That came out sharper than I intended. Kyle held up a hand in apology and went back toward the truck. Halfway there, he stopped. "Did you hear that?" I hadn't, until he said it. Then it came again, knocking, not from below, from inside the old hoist house foundation to our left, where only 3 waist-high concrete walls remained, and brush had grown through the cracks. Slow at first, then faster. A hand or something like a hand striking metal in an uneven pattern. Kyle started toward it before I could stop him. "Don't," I said. He looked back. Probably somebody dumped sheet metal in there. The knocking stopped. Then a voice from inside the foundation said very clearly, "How many up there?" Kyle froze. The voice was male, breathless, and old-fashioned, in a way I can't explain, except that it sounded like someone speaking across a long distance on a line with too much static. There was urgency in it, but not panic. The tone of a man working a problem. "How many up there?" it asked again. I moved faster than I had all morning, grabbed Kyle by the jacket, and pulled him toward the truck hard enough that he nearly fell. He started swearing, confused and angry, and I shoved him into the passenger seat before he could turn back around. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he said. "Seatbelt." Dan, seatbelt now. Something in my face must have convinced him because he stopped arguing long enough to click it in. I got behind the wheel and backed out so fast, the rear tires spun mud off the road. Neither of us spoke until we reached pavement. Then Kyle said, "There was somebody there." "No, I heard him. I know." "What do you mean, no?" I kept my eyes on the road. "I mean there wasn't supposed to be." He laughed once, short and frightened. "That's not better." I still didn't tell him about the rules. That failure cost me later. Kyle filed his notes. I filed mine. We used careful language. Unexplained auditory phenomenon. Suspicious unauthorized repair. Recommend temporary law enforcement welfare sweep if evidence of trespass continues. Nobody acted immediately because nothing we wrote met the threshold for emergency response. No visible entry. No confirmed person on site. Limited staff. That's bureaucracy. You can hate it, but it usually has a reason. 3 days later, a deputy called our office, asking whether any crews were working at the old Cambria site, because a pickup had been found parked near the access bridge overnight. with nobody around. The truck belonged to Kyle. I was the one who drove out there with the deputy. His pickup sat exactly where he'd left it, locked, with a fast food cup in the holder, and his field binder on the seat. Tire tracks showed he had arrived after dark the previous evening. One set of boot prints led from the driver's door toward the access road. No return prints. The deputy, a tired man named Halloran who had done enough rural searches to know how quickly they go bad, asked me if Kyle had any reason to visit the site alone. I said no. That was true in the narrowest possible sense. Search and rescue came in by morning with volunteers, K9, ATV teams, and state police. They worked the road, the ridges, the drainage ditch, the brush lines, and the neighboring parcels. They found nothing until a volunteer came up from the clearing holding Kyle's hard hat. It had been placed upright on the concrete cap of shaft 13. Inside it was Kyle's notepad, folded once. On the top page, written in his handwriting, were 4 words. He asked for account. Halloran wanted to treat that as evidence of disorientation or prank activity. I let him. I did not bring out the notebook in front of the volunteers. I'm not sure whether that was discipline or cowardice. The state closed the site more aggressively after Kyle disappeared. New fencing, new locks, signage, motion cameras on temporary posts, and authorization for a deeper hazard review because, if a missing man was potentially down a compromised shaft, there had to be an effort to determine that. Liability alone guaranteed it. That review put me back at shaft 13 with a small team. Not an underground team. Not yet. Just me. A geotechnical contractor named Elaine Foster, 2 labor crew guys to stage equipment and set replacement posts, and Deputy Halloran for site security. So it was January by then. Snow in the shaded cuts, hard frozen ground in patches, the kind of cold that made every metal surface punish your gloves. I almost backed out that morning. I had Frank's notebook in my bag. I had Kyle's last words in my head. I had no excuse that would hold up. So I went. Elaine was practical and skeptical in a way I appreciated. She cared about measurements, crack width, frost jacking, fill settlement. She didn't care about local stories unless they affected her invoice. Halloran was more superstitious than he wanted to admit. The labor guys just wanted to finish before dark. We started fine. Camera poles checked. Battery box vandalized on 1 unit, though the memory card was still in place. I pulled it, and later, we reviewed it in the truck. The footage had gaps from dead battery, then a sequence from the previous night, around 2:11 a.m. The clearing was empty, snow crust shining in infrared, fence motionless. Then, over the course of 14 seconds, a line of dark marks appeared in the snow between one frame and the next. Boot prints, not being made, already there. Each frame after that showed one additional print farther toward the cap, as if something invisible was only visible by the depressions it left behind. There was no body, no shadow, just the prints arriving one at a time. Elaine watched without expression until the sequence ended at the vent pipe. Camera glitch, she said. Halloran said nothing. I said, "Can you explain the pattern?" "No," she said, "but that doesn't mean I have to call it anything special." I respected her for that answer even then. We returned to work. Halloran stayed at the truck. The labor crew reset the western posts. Elaine checked the north edge drainage swale with a grade rod. I did a full perimeter walk with gas readings, mostly to keep moving and keep my mind occupied. Near the north side, where the ground dipped toward a line of old spoil and brush, I noticed something new protruding from frozen mud. A length of black cable. Old, thick, not power cable. Mine signal or communication line, maybe. It snaked out of the ground where frost heave had lifted shallow fill. I knelt, brushed away slush, and found it didn't end there. It ran toward the cap, toward the vent assembly. There should not have been any live system connected to anything below. Everything historical at the site was supposed to be dead, severed, buried, or removed. Yet here it was, emerging from ground the drawings showed as backfilled decades earlier. I called Elaine over. She inspected it, shrugged, and said we could note legacy cable exposure for future excavation. As she stood up, the cable twitched. Not much. A small pulling motion, as if something below had taken up slack. Elaine stared at it. We both waited. It twitched again, harder. Then from the radio clipped at my chest, my own voice said, "How many on the surface?" I hit the power switch off so hard I nearly tore the radio free. Elaine stepped back. "Was that you?" "No." Halloran started calling from the truck. One of the labor guys had heard something too. We regrouped by the vehicles. Nobody wanted to say what they thought. The air felt changed, warmer in thin intermittent currents that came and went against the general cold. Not enough to show as steam, enough to notice on the face. Halloran said, "We can clear the site and come back with more people." That was the sensible suggestion. Instead, one of the labor guys, named Petrovich, looked toward the cap and said, "There's a hole." He was right. Not large, maybe 8 inches across. A clean black opening near the vent collar, where the concrete cap had not been broken a minute before. I am certain of that. Elaine had photographed the cap earlier from 3 angles. No hole. Now one looked up at us. Warm air moved out of it, carrying that same faint lamp oil smell. No one went closer at first. Petrovich said, "Ground shifted." Elaine said, "No spall pattern. That doesn't make sense." Then something struck metal below. 1 bell. Then 2. Then 3. Halloran actually crossed himself, quick and angry like he hated himself for doing it. Rule 1. Leave. We started moving for the trucks, but the ground shuddered underfoot. Not a collapse. Not exactly. More like a deep settling thump from below, followed by a wet crack along the north edge. Elaine shouted as 2 feet of frozen fill slumped inward, dragging a section of fence with it. The drop that opened wasn't straight down. It sheared diagonally, exposing rotten timber and void space beneath the cap apron. And caught in the slump was cloth, Orange County issue winter jacket fabric. Kyle had been wearing one when he disappeared. Everything after that became harder to stop because now there was justification. Maybe not enough for a rescue entry that second, but enough for Halloran to call it in as probable human remains, or evidence accessible within the collapse margin. Enough for command staff to authorize a confined review by a trained recovery team the following day. Enough for everyone to stop treating my silence as caution and start treating it as a problem when I finally showed them Frank's notebook that evening. Halloran read it twice. Elaine called it irresponsible folklore. My supervisor asked why I hadn't produced it sooner. I didn't have a good answer. The recovery team came from outside the district. 2 mine rescue guys with current confined space credentials, a safety officer, atmospheric gear, tripod, line systems, and enough procedure to make everyone feel better. The plan was limited. Inspect the newly opened void at the collapse margin, determine whether the visible cloth was attached to remains or debris, and assess whether any larger access pathway existed below the cap. No descent through the shaft itself. No heroics. I argued against going after noon. That got me looks. One of the rescue men, Alvarez, read the notebook and handed it back without comment. Later, privately, he asked me where the line about not giving numbers came from. I told him the incident copy from 1947. He nodded once and said, "Then don't." That was the first time someone else took it seriously, without making me defend it. We were on site at 8 a.m. The sky clear, air bitter, snow glare harsh on the open ground. I had not slept. None of us said that. The collapse margin looked worse in daylight. The void under the apron opened into a slanting space, lined with broken timber and rock. The orange fabric was still visible, snagged on a protruding beam maybe 6 feet in. One of the rescue men went online, belly crawled to the edge, and used a pole camera. He backed away after 30 seconds and said, "That jacket's empty, just fabric, torn loose, wrapped around timber, no body." But beyond it, The camera had caught a wider continuation into darkness that did not match any mapped void near the surface. The safety officer wanted to stop there and reassess. Alvarez asked for one more look. He went back with better lighting. I watched the monitor from the tripod station. The camera fed us splintered timber, coal smear, pooled water, then a drop into a low heading that ran farther than any near-surface collapse cavity should have run. The floor timbers looked wet and intact in places, impossibly so for workings abandoned that long. There were track impressions in mud, old narrow-gauge rails half buried, and on the right-hand rib, chalk marks, vertical lines, tally marks, groups of 5 stretching down the wall until the beam couldn't reach farther. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then over the open comm line came Alvarez's voice from the edge, tight and controlled. "There's airflow," he said. "Warm," the safety officer said. "Back out." Alvarez did not move. "What is it?" I asked. He answered after a pause. "There's light down there." Every scalp hair I had lifted at once. The camera tilted, deep in the heading, around what should have been total black. A small yellow point moved once and steadied. A carbide lamp flame, not electric, not reflection. A living little flame, with that specific soft halo old lamps have. The notebook flashed in my head. "Leave it where it is." The safety officer ordered Alvarez back again, sharper this time. Alvarez began withdrawing, slowly, because of the line and debris. As he did, the camera snagged and jostled. The lamp disappeared from frame. For one terrible second, all we had was blurred timber and rock. Then a voice came through the comm, not Alvarez. "How many still waiting?" The line filled with static. Alvarez shouted something lost in the noise. His safety line jerked once, twice, then went slack. 3 of us moved at once before the safety officer could stop us. The second rescue man grabbed the line. I grabbed the tripod leg, and Halloran took shoulder on the backup rope. We hauled. The line came in hard, and suddenly easy, wrong both ways. Alvarez emerged from the edge coated in black mud from the chest down. Helmet torn off, face gray with shock. He clawed at the frozen ground until he cleared the void, and then curled on his side, vomiting water. The second rescue man leaned over him. "What happened?" Alvarez kept coughing. Finally he said, "Somebody had the line." Nobody answered. His gloved hands were clenched white. When he opened one, there was something in his palm. A brass check tag, old miner identification token, oval and stamped with a number. The safety officer shut the operation down on the spot. He did not need folklore to justify that. Compromised void, unexplained comm interference, near loss of entrant, site secured, pending higher review. That should have buried it for good. It didn't, because 2 nights later, they found another note. This one on my truck, folded under the wiper after I parked outside my apartment. Plain lined paper, damp around the edges. In a handwriting I recognized from Kyle's field notes, though shakier, were the words, "He doesn't like to be left uncounted." No police officer on earth is equipped for that sentence. Halloran took it seriously because he had been on site. State police took it seriously because now a missing employee might be alive and contacting co-workers. My apartment, office, phone records, and truck got looked over. Nothing useful turned up. No prints of value. No cameras where I parked. No witness. Halloran asked me, off the record, whether I thought Kyle was alive. I told him I didn't know. That was the last clean answer I ever gave. The pressure built after that. A missing public employee, a near incident with recovery personnel, odd evidence, media interest starting to flicker at the edges. The state wanted a conclusion. If there was a hidden connected entry, if somebody was using old workings as shelter, if there was criminal activity, it had to be identified. Geological consultants reviewed plans and believed there might be a partially intact accessway through collapse from the old hoist house side into an upper receiving chamber adjacent to the shaft, sealed historically, but perhaps reopened by subsidence. which meant someone would eventually have to go below. I wish I could tell you I refused. I didn't. Partly because of Kyle. Partly because I had seen enough by then that leaving it to strangers felt worse. Mostly because fear does something ugly to a person's judgment when it lasts too long. You stop wanting safety and start wanting the thing to either finish or explain itself. The entry team was cut down to 4. Alvarez recovered enough to insist on going back. His partner McCready, me, because I knew the site history and the notebook, and a safety officer named Lynn. Surface support would be Halloran, Elaine for monitoring deformation markers, and 2 techs at the lines. Limited entry only. In and out by noon. No direct shaft descent. Use the collapse access if stable. Confirm whether there was any viable continuation. Search for evidence of Kyle, and exit. I didn't tell anyone about Rule 7 until that morning. Alvarez listened, then set one of our spare floodlights on the surface, 50 feet back from the hole, angled away toward the road. "Humor you," he said. I appreciated that more than if he'd mocked me. We entered at 9:18 a.m. The first chamber below wasn't natural cave dark the way people imagine. It was industrial dark, which is worse. Geometry hidden just beyond your light. Angles. Wet beams. Rusted metal shapes that look like machinery, and bones in turns. The air was warm enough to fog the edge of my face shield compared to the outside cold, and it smelled of coal dust gone sour with water, mud, old iron, and underneath it that same faint lamp oil trace. We moved low through the collapse gap into a chamber of broken cribbing and fallen roof rock, where an old cable drum lay half sunk in muck. Beyond that, the ground leveled into what had once been a receiving area near the shaft collar below. I knew that only from the plans. In person, it looked less like a room than the remains of one. Timbers black with age, sections of track, a rotted platform edge, and ahead, blocked partly by caved material, the dark circular throat of the shaft itself, rising out of our light and disappearing above toward the cap. I had expected the shaft to be invisible under the sealed surface. Instead, there was open space around it, not fully open. Enough. McCready checked air, within acceptable range. Lynn marked time and route. Alvarez photographed. We worked professionally, because that is what people do, when professionalism is the only barrier between function and panic. On the mud near the track, we found footprints. Fresh, not decades-old impressions preserved somehow. Fresh water-sheened boot prints, Kyle's size maybe. They led from the shaft edge into a side heading on the east wall. "Could be ours from prior contact?" Lynn said. "No," I said immediately. "Because they began at the shaft, same as on the surface." No one contradicted me. We followed them. The side heading was low and surprisingly intact for 30 yards. Timbers in decent condition, where they should have long since failed. Water running in the ditch along one side, except at 2 points, where it paused and drew inward toward cracks in the floor, as though the whole mine were breathing. Rule 4. Do not stay long enough to photograph it. I almost said that out loud and stopped myself. Instead, I urged speed. Alvarez noticed anyway. He took one quick shot and moved on. Halfway down the heading, we found a lunch pail. Tin, dented, ancient. One clasp broken. Inside was nothing but black water and a miner's check stub fused to the bottom by rust. Number worn away. McCready muttered, "That wasn't here on the video." No one argued. Then the radio at Lynn's shoulder clicked. Halloran's voice came through from the surface. "Status check," Lynn answered automatically. "Team progressing east heading, all good." A second later, his own words came back. "Team progressing east heading, all good," his radio said, but slower, and trailing that same throat-wet scrape I'd heard in my truck. Lynn shut it off at once. We all heard the next transmission anyway. It came not from the radio, but from farther ahead in the dark. "Come farther. One more and the count is right." McCready whispered something I didn't catch. Alvarez said very quietly, "No response." We kept moving because retreating down a confined heading while frightened is how accidents multiply. Better to reach the turnaround point we'd already set and come back controlled. That was the plan, until we rounded a support set and saw the lamp. It sat on the ground at the edge of a widened section of tunnel where the roof rose enough to stand fully. Small brass carbide lamp, lit with a steady yellow flame. Beside it lay a wool cap dark with moisture and age. No one approached. I could hear everybody breathing inside their masks. Alvarez said, "Photograph from here." Lin did. The beam from his helmet moved past the lamp and struck the wall beyond it. Names, carved into the coal or slate rib with something sharp. Dozens of names, stacked and crossed, some followed by dates, some by nothing at all. A few were old, 1931, 1947, 1952. Some were newer. One said Preston. One said Kyle Burns. The date after Kyle's name was tomorrow's, not the next day from the entry. I mean tomorrow, from the day I am writing this down now? No. Even now I have trouble saying it properly because the date shifted in my head when I saw it. At the time, it was a date 3 days in the future. Lin saw it too. That's not possible. The lamp flame bent once, though there was no visible draft. Then, from somewhere beyond the reach of our lights, came footsteps. Measured, heavy, more than one set, coming toward us. There are sounds that strip training away, because they arrive carrying a certainty older than thought. Those footsteps did. Men walking in a line underground, where no men should have been for 70 years. Boots in mud. Metal. Somewhere lightly striking metal with each step, like tools hanging from belts. Alvarez said, "Back." None of us argued. We withdrew, not running yet, keeping lights on the floor and walls, trying not to snag the line or lose footing. The footsteps continued at the same pace, not hurrying, not slowing, closing anyway. Then someone behind us in the dark said, close enough to feel in the back of the neck, "Hold for the cage." McCready broke discipline first and ran. That set the rest of us off. We hit the receiving chamber almost together. Lin nearly fell on the track. I grabbed his harness and shoved him forward. The shaft opening to our left was no longer dark. There was movement below it, upward movement, something carrying a cage signal lamp or lamps rising through the center void where no cage should have existed. And the bell began ringing. Fast this time, not 3 measured strikes. Continuous frantic signaling like a crew desperate for hoist. Alvarez yelled for the exit gap. We cut across the chamber toward the collapse opening and all stopped at once. The floodlight beam from the surface had turned. Instead of pointing toward the road behind us, a white bar of light now shone straight down through the collapse gap into the chamber, angled at the shaft. Rule 7. Do not come back up that way. Panic has a texture. It narrows the world to whatever choice is still moving. McCready went for the gap anyway. I shouted after him, but the bell was so loud by then it swallowed words. He crawled into the debris slope and started climbing toward the surface light. Halfway up he stopped. At first I thought he'd snagged. Then he began backing down much faster than he'd gone up, not using hands right, sliding, scraping, eyes locked on whatever he saw above. "What is it?" Lin shouted. McCready hit the chamber floor hard enough to lose his helmet. Blood ran down one cheek. He kept trying to stand and failing, staring at the gap. "There's people at the top," he said. "Halloran?" Alvarez asked. McCready shook his head violently. "No, they're looking down." A hand touched the edge of the collapse gap above us, black with mud to the wrist. Then another. Then a face leaned into view against the surface light. It was not a face I knew, but it was a human face, in the worst possible way, familiar enough in structure to be recognized, wrong enough in stillness to break something in the brain. White eyes reflecting our lamps, coal-black water running from the mouth. Old miner's cap fused to the skull by rot or shadow. Then other faces gathered around it, stacked behind the first, all peering down into the chamber, as if we were the ones trapped below. and they had come to check on us. MacCready started screaming then. Full, raw, animal sound. The first time anyone had lost control like that. The faces above opened their mouths together. How many left? They asked. I don't know who answered. Maybe none of us. Maybe one of us made a sound that counted as a number. What I do know is the chamber changed the second after, as if some quiet agreement had been reached without our consent. The bell stopped. The rising lights in the shaft below halted, and from somewhere deeper in the mine, many footsteps broke into a run. Alvarez grabbed my sleeve and dragged me toward a secondary heading on the far side of the chamber not shown on the reviewed plan. Lynn hauled MacCready. We had no better option. The collapse exit was blocked by whatever stood above it, and the shaft side had become something I could not force myself to look at directly anymore. The secondary heading sloped up, narrow and wet, with old air pipe bolted along one wall. We ran half-bent, slamming shoulders and helmets on timbers, lights jerking. Behind us came the sounds of pursuit. Not theatrical snarling, not monster noises. Men running in heavy boots through water. Breath, equipment striking belts. The terrifying thing was how workmanlike it sounded, as if a shift had been called unexpectedly, and they were all hurrying to station. The heading forked. Alvarez chose left by instinct or airflow. We followed into a chamber where the roof rose high, and the floor changed from mud to planks. Our lights found another room of old infrastructure, hoist parts, coils of cable, a table collapsed on one side, ledger pages plastered wet to the floor, and on the far wall, painted in white block letters big enough to read across the room, "Do not give them the surface count that stopped us." The paint looked old, not fresh warning scrawl, old company lettering, maybe wartime emergency instruction, except nobody writes a warning like that, unless something has already gone very wrong. Lynn said, "Who is them?" Nobody answered because we all heard the elevator machinery. I know there was no elevator, no cage, no active hoist. I know that. Still, from behind the wall to our right came the heavy clanking, cable whining, brake chattering rise of a shaft cage being pulled toward a landing. The whole room vibrated with it. Then a man's voice on the other side of that wall shouted, "Open the gate. We've still got men below." Another voice answered from farther down. "How many?" Silence followed, thick enough to feel. Then, gently, the first voice said, "Don't make me count them again." Alvarez was the only one keeping any coherent thought by then. He swept the room, found a narrow manway ladder rising through a broken hatch in the ceiling, and pointed. Up. We started climbing. I went third after Lynn and MacCready. Alvarez came last. The ladder was old steel rungs set into timber, slick with condensation but solid. It rose maybe 20 feet into a cramped upper drift where cold air seeped from somewhere ahead. Real cold air. Surface cold. Hope. Below us the machinery stopped. Then the bell rang once. Alvarez, still on the ladder, looked up and said, "Move." We moved. The upper drift was barely passable. Rockfall forced crawling in places. Timbers pressed low enough to scrape our backs, but it trended upward, and the air sharpened with leaf mold and winter. We could hear wind somewhere ahead, faint but real. That was enough. Then MacCready, who was crawling first, stopped so abruptly Lynn kicked his boots. "What now?" Lynn snapped. MacCready didn't answer. I edged up enough to see past him and wished I hadn't. There was an opening ahead, daylight leaking through brush and stone, where part of a forgotten drift mouth had collapsed outward onto a slope. Escape, maybe 30 feet away. Standing in that opening, blocking most of the winter light, was Kyle. At least I thought it was Kyle at first. Same jacket, same build, same face in outline under the hard hat. He stood with one hand on the rock, like a man waiting for us to finish a conversation. "Dan," he said, calm as anything. "You left before the count was done." My mouth had gone dry. "Kyle?" He smiled a little. "Not right. Too slow. Come on," he said. "I can get you out." Behind me, Alvarez whispered, "Don't." Kyle looked past me toward the others as if he had heard that perfectly well. "There are 6 below still waiting," he said. "If we don't make the count right, they keep bringing the cage up empty." Something moved in the dark behind us down the drift. Boots on rock, coming steady. Lynn said, "We need through." Kyle's head tilted. "Then tell me how many are on the surface." That was the trap. Simple as a child's question. Count the living. Call the missing. Balance the shift. Some old disaster logic preserved past death. I understood it then. Not fully, but enough. Something had happened during that 1947 delay. Maybe earlier too. Men below, men above. A cage signal. A foreman or rescue captain trying to account for who remained. A count given wrong or refused or manipulated, and whatever waited in Shaft 13 had been trying to finish that ledger ever since. Not a monster in the ordinary sense. A process, an unfinished reckoning, wearing whatever faces were useful. I don't know why that thought mattered, except that it gave me one final practical instinct in place of panic. I said to Kyle, "I don't know." He smiled wider. "You do." "No," I said, and I meant it in the only way available. "I don't know who's on the surface anymore." For the first time, his expression changed. Not anger, confusion. Behind us, the footsteps quickened. Alvarez lunged forward then, not at Kyle, but at the rotten ribs beside the drift mouth. He slammed his shoulder into loosened rock and timber hard enough to bring part of the opening down. Stone and earth crashed between us and the figure in the light. One rock clipped my helmet. Another struck Lynn's shoulder. Cold air blasted through the new gap. Daylight narrowed but remained. "Go!" Alvarez shouted. We crawled through dirt, roots, and broken stone like animals burrowing out of a grave. McCready made it first, then Lynn. I shoved upward onto a steep leaf-covered slope among scrub oak and briars. Hands grabbed my harness from above. Halloran, and one of the surface techs, white-faced, hauling. I turned to help Alvarez. He was halfway through when something seized his left leg from below. Not imagined, not metaphorical. I saw both his gloved hands clawing at dirt as his body jerked backward down into the dark under the collapse. For one instant his lamp lit the opening behind him, and I saw shapes packed in the drift, shoulder to shoulder, hard hats and pale faces, and black mouths all pointed upward. Then Halloran and I pulled together, and Alvarez came free, with his boot gone. We got him out. The drift mouth behind us collapsed the rest of the way seconds later. No one said anything for a long time. We were on a wooded slope 200 yards east of the main shaft clearing. At a hidden old emergency drift nobody had on any current access map. Elaine found us first, because she had seen movement in the trees after surface comms failed. Halloran swore he had never left the primary clearing, never moved the floodlight, never seen faces at the collapse gap. The surface techs backed him. The floodlight, when we returned hours later with state police and no intention of going back below, was still where Alvarez had placed it, aimed toward the road. McCready resigned within the month. Lynn transferred districts. Alvarez kept the brass tag marked 13 for exactly 1 week, then mailed it to me with no note. I burned my hand touching it through the envelope paper, not metaphorically either. The skin blistered across my thumb and forefinger. I threw the tag into the Monongahela that same evening and watched it sink. As for Kyle, he was never found. Officially, he remains a missing person. Unofficially, there was pressure to reduce public discussion around the site. Hazard closure expanded. The state contracted a major grout and seal operation that spring, using remote methods only. They poured thousands of cubic yards into mapped accessible voids, collapsed the hidden drift, reinforced the cap footprint, widened exclusion fencing, and removed the site road from general use. On paper, Shaft 13 is now mitigated. I have not worked field inspections since. That part usually disappoints people when I tell them. They want the tough ending, The narrator who keeps doing the job with a haunted stare and a flask in his desk. The truth is simpler. I discovered there are some places where competence becomes a way of standing still in front of something that has no use for it. I moved into records review and historical hazard assessment for a while, then left altogether. I have a smaller life now, quieter. I sleep badly in rain, and worse in cold weather. Some sounds I cannot tolerate. Metal striking metal underground is one. Radio feedback is another. I still have Frank's notebook. I added to it. Not everything. Not the parts that feel like infection when written down. Enough that if it ever gets handed to someone else, they will know the rules mattered. I also did something Frank never did. I searched deeper into the archives. Old mine maps, county death lists, newspaper microfilm, company proceedings, coroner's summaries. It took months. Most of it led nowhere. Then I found a regional paper clipping from March of 1931 about the cave-in at the mine. 6 confirmed dead, several trapped temporarily, delayed hoist operations during smoke conditions. Nothing surprising. But tucked in the next week's edition was a short correction to an earlier report. One paragraph, easy to miss. It stated that during the first surface accounting after the collapse, one foreman had mistakenly reported the wrong number of men clear because he counted the rescue crew as part of the outbound shift. The error, the paper said, created confusion regarding who remained below during the period when cage signaling resumed unexpectedly. That line sat in front of me a long time. Confusion regarding who remained below. A bureaucratic phrase for a wound that never closed. Maybe that's all Shaft 13 is. The shape left behind when too many men died waiting for somebody above to count correctly. Maybe every bell, every voice, every face is just the mine running that moment over and over, trying to balance a ledger written wrong in panic. Maybe Kyle is dead, and what spoke in his voice only needed a familiar mouth. Maybe none of them are dead in the way we mean it, I don't know. I have stopped pretending ignorance is the same thing as disbelief. What I do know is this. Last winter, long after the site was sealed, I got a call from Halloran, who had retired by then and moved 2 counties south. He said a hunting buddy of his had found an old fenced mine clearing while tracking deer and noticed a work light out in the woods facing the wrong direction. Halloran wanted to know whether any crews had been sent in. I asked him which site. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "The one with the count." I told him no crews had been there. He said he figured as much. Then he told me one more thing before hanging up. His buddy had taken a picture at dusk from outside the fence line. In the photo, the cap and warning signs were visible. So was the floodlight, standing in snow, aimed straight at the shaft. And behind the fence, half hidden by the vent pipe, was a man in an Orange County jacket, looking up toward the camera as if waiting to be recognized. Halloran asked if I wanted the photo. I told him no. That was the truth when I said it. It stopped being true around 2 in the morning. I called him back 3 times before dawn. No answer. I drove to his old place at first light and found it empty. Neighbor said he'd gone out before sunrise. Truck gone. No note. No sign of struggle. He hasn't been seen since. So I'm writing this for one reason only. Not to warn thrill seekers. People like that don't listen. Not to solve anything either. I don't think this can be solved by the kind of people who believe every problem is just a better map and enough concrete. I'm writing it because if you work old ground long enough, somebody will eventually hand you a story disguised as a safety note, and you will think the story is the extra part. It isn't. The story is what remains after the useful language has worn off. If you ever find yourself at an old shaft in Pennsylvania, or Ohio, or West Virginia, or anywhere men once went underground, and some of them never came back upright, and if you hear a bell where no cage has moved in generations, do not go closer to listen. If your radio gives your own words back with someone else's breath inside them, shut it off. If boot prints begin where open grows and says they shouldn't, leave them alone. If water climbs uphill toward a hole, you are already too late. If someone below asks how many are left on the surface, say you don't know, and pray that is still true. And if you ever see a lamp burning where no hand should be alive to light it, leave it there, because the worst thing about Shaft 13 is not that something is trapped below. It's that after all these years, it still believes the shift isn't over, and every time someone goes near that place, it starts counting again.